All right. So we're going to welcome in someone who is more behind the scenes. If you don't know who he is, look at his Wikipedia. It's very impressive. He is an absolute legend in the A&R world. I believe his Metal Injection said the best metal and rock A&R person of all time, or something crazy like that. Spent many, many years at Roadrunner Records, signing a bunch of incredible bands, including one we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And now he's at Nuclear Blast Records doing the same thing. Mr. Monte Conner, how are you, sir?
How you doing, Brian? Very honored to be here. Thank you for
Honored
all
to have you.
Thank you for all the nice things you said about me. But if anybody asks me who my A&R hero is and who the person I look up to is, it's you, because you've been doing it. You've been doing it since 1982, a good 5-6 years before me. So you're the guy I look up to. So thank you for the nice words, but I have to give it back.
Yeah, thank you. That's just because I'm old, but that's okay. I'll take it. I'll take it. So we're going to talk about death today. We're going to talk about the band Deicide today. I've got too many of these bands on my brain. We're going to talk about the band Deicide today. So I have to admit that I was not in early on the death metal thing. It took me a little while to get to it. Not that I didn't like it or think it was cool. It took me a minute to warm up to it. You, on the other hand, were one of the early adopters of this genre. So where did you first hear it, and what drew you to it?
Well, I mean, I first discovered death metal when it was, when it was invented, right? Who invented death metal? I think these days a lot of people will credit the band Possessed, because they actually coined the word, right? They had the song death metal, so Technically they were probably the first to use it. I can't recall if Possessed predates death, though. I don't remember when Seven Churches came out or the Possessed demo, but I know that a lot of people would say Chuck Schuldiner and Death are the ones that invented the genre.
I've gone back and talked to a lot of people, and I think you make a very valid point with Possessed, and they were on a Metal Massacre early on, like probably 86 or so. So they probably were early, and you can go back, when you talk about who invented heavy metal, it's obviously Black Sabbath, but you go back to Blue Cheer and some of that stuff too. And I think it's kind of similar with death metal, but I think just Death and Chuck Schuldiner that you mentioned was the guy that, that when that first Death record came out, that was okay. Oh, there's a genre here.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I heard the early Mantis demos. Mantis is the band that became Death. If I'm remembering correctly, I heard those even before I heard the Possessed demo. So for me, just looking back, it's definitely those two bands, but probably Death for me. And so I was right there, as part of the scene in the 80s, being a tape trader, being really into the whole underground emerging scene. And that's the first time I heard the music, and I just fell in love with it, because you know what it's like back in the 80s, Brian, like when this new form of music emerged, right? It's like, once you hear Venom, okay, what comes after Venom? What's heavier than Venom, right? And then you just keep craving the next heaviest thing. And when death metal came along, those were the heaviest vocals you could get. Like, you couldn't really say that Venom has death metal vocals, right? I mean, Kronos is, kind of death metal vocals, but not really, not like the kind of vocals Jeff Becerra is doing or what Chuck Schuldiner was doing. So naturally, when death metal came along and I heard those type of vocals, okay, that was my new favorite kind of music. That was like as heavy as it could get. That was like the new frontier of what we were into. So I was into it from the beginning, but I didn't start at Roadrunner until early 1988. So I wasn't in a position to sign some of these bands. I was just like an observer, right? And then, of course, I got lucky enough to be in a position to start signing death metal myself. And at the time, it was really the only label I was competing against really was Earache. It was Roadrunner and Earache trying to sign all the cool bands. Although you came in fairly early with Cannibal Corpse, right? Eating Back to Life was what, 89?
89, but it was still a couple of years after. I mean, you guys and Relapse was in there as well, I think, right. Signing a whole, like, really the cream of the crop of all that early death metal stuff.
Yeah. But hey, you got a good one. I mean, Cannibal Corpse arguably are the most successful death metal band ever, and for several reasons, because they're the longest running. They're the band that has consistently been putting out records the whole time. So they have the most records, therefore the most sales, the most streams. Like, they are like the godfathers of death metal. So at least you may not be a death metal expert, but you got the king band.
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew to really love it. I love it now, obviously. If you listen to the label, but it's probably more than any other genres, probably where we at. And then there's all the subgenres of death metal. Like, for example, I just saw Amon Amarth last night open for Pantera. And Amon Amarth is, they're melodic death metal is like what they call it.
Right.
But they've kind of morphed into just a regular metal band, I think. And they're, strangely enough, they become an arena band. Like every time I see them,
Right.
they're playing arenas. It's insane. But the Cannibal thing was really funny too, just to give you a bit of an example of where I was at with the death metal scene at that point. So your friend and my friend who's been at Metal Blade forever, Mike Faley, who's from Buffalo, New York, brought in this demo tape from this band from Buffalo, New York, named Cannibal Corpse. And before I even put it in, I looked at the song titles, and there's song on there called "A Skull Full of Maggots." And I said, I don't really care if this sounds any good. I want to sign it just because I want to put out a song called "A Skull Full of Maggots."
And that's such a tame title compared to the shit that came out.
Well, yeah. At the time, that was cool.
Brian, what's ironic? You're mentioning Buffalo, because I had a person in my office that also came from Buffalo, who's a DJ at a radio station, Mark Psycho Abramson, right? We called him Psycho back then, but now he wants his respect. Got to call him Mark Abramson. And, Mark was doing radio for us, and he knew about Cannibal Corpse. And really, this was at the height of me, like, grabbing any death metal I could get. He was trying to get me to sign Cannibal Corpse. And I just wasn't into it. Like, I just didn't think it was as good as some of the other stuff I was signing. But then, of course, I lived to regret that decision. And it wasn't so much Eaten Back to Life. It was, what was the second record?
Butchered at Birth.
Right. When I heard Butchered at Birth, right, that's when I was like, shit, I should have signed these guys, So, Cannibal was on my radar, but you can't have them all, right?
Exactly. Because it's interesting when because once I started getting more into death metal, I just talking to people about, so what, like, where did this come from? And really what it boiled down to, the early death metalers were like, hey, look, music's getting heavier and heavier and heavier, but the vocals can only go so far when you're singing. So what's the natural progression? Let's do something heavier, and let's make it sound as heavy as the music. And that's when it really clicked in my head, like, that makes a lot of sense, because now the vocals are just as heavy as the music, and it became, so extreme.
But then it changed also, because if you're listening to a band like Death didn't have blast beats, right?
Correct.
Like, okay, so you had Death, that when you had the death metal genre form. Okay, how do we make death metal heavier? Well, let's bring in blast beats.
Yeah.
And then you had Morbid Angel bringing in blast beats, Napalm Death, right? Like, that was like the next frontier for death metal, Suffocation, and that made it even heavier.
So we're talking about Deicide today, and the great song "Death by Dawn." Why? So what did you pick Deicide to begin with, and why this song?
Well, interestingly enough, the way I found Deicide was that they had gone in and made a demo with Scott Burns. I'm sure you were in touch with Scott Burns a lot back then as well. But anytime a band would come through Morrisound that was unsigned and would make a demo, if Scott felt it was worthy, he would start sending it out to his friends at labels. And I was doing a lot of business with Scott Burns back then. We did Obituary, Slowly We Rot, we did Beneath the Remains. I was pretty much the first guy to hire Scott Burns to start producing and mixing. So we had a really, really close relationship, and he had Deicide in, right? And they had recorded, they were called Amon at the time, and they had come in to record a 6-song demo. We call it a demo, but when you're recording at Morrisound, I mean, it's not a demo, it's a professional recording. The bands call it a demo because it's what they're going to take to shop, right? But it's not really a demo, it's a master tape. And Scott had told them that they should send it to me. Glenn is originally from Buffalo, like Cannibal Corpse. And I guess Malevolent Creation, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Malevolent Creation has roots in Buffalo. So Glenn was up in Buffalo visiting his parents, right? So driving back to Florida, he stopped by in my office, just unannounced, came barging in, threw the demo down on my on my desk, and we had a brief conversation. And he told me that they had done it with Scott, which right away piqued my interest. And the minute he left the office, I played the demo, right? The demo became a record. We put that demo out later as a record called Amon Feasting the Beast. So you could hear that 6-song demo that I signed them from. It's on that release. And the minute I heard it, it just blew me away. Because where I think that Deicide edged all other death metal bands was in Glenn's vocals. I mean, Glenn is just still to this day my favorite death metal vocalist. And when I say that, I mean the Glenn from back in that era. Obviously, he's older now. Your voice has changed. You're in a different place. But I'm talking about the Glenn when he first started out. The enunciation in his voice, the power that he had, it just blew me away. And also, he doesn't get enough credit for this, but Glenn is the guy that pioneered the use of like double tracking vocals. Like you're having these heavy guttural vocals, then you're having like a high pitched demon scream behind it, right? Nobody was doing that before Glenn. And if you listen to the first Deicide record, you have that layering all over the record. And specifically in the song Dead by Dawn, which is one of the reasons why I suggest that this be the song we talk about, because that's the song on the record that most employs that technique. I mean, you hear it all over the place. And when I heard it, I'm like, I'd never heard anything like it. I just thought it made it just sound fucking insane. And yeah, I just fell in love with it. The minute Glenn left my office and I popped that tape in, I was just like, I have to have this. I have to sign this band. And that was before I even knew about what a character Glenn was, that he would burn an upside down cross in his head, you know, like the whole shtick that goes along with Glenn Benton. I fell in love with Deicide for their music, and getting Glenn Benton and all his antics, and you know, that was just like icing on the cake, you know.
Right? Yeah,
afterwards.
right. It's interesting because, you know, I talked to so many different people, especially, you know, guys our age that never got into death metal, don't understand it. And I try to explain to them, and it's kind of the same with any sort of genre that you don't understand, any type of music you don't understand, I guess. But it all, to me, it all comes down to melody. And like, what people ask me, well, what's the difference between all these different death metal bands? Well, it's just melody like anything else. There's melody in all these songs, just like there's melody in Slayer or Metallica or whatever it is. And vocally and musically, there's a melody, and the good bands have better melodies and in what they're doing, and the other bands not so much. And especially the vocals, because that's the one thing that where everybody kind of stops and goes like, I can't get into the vocals. It's like, well, if you really listen to them, there's a lot of melody in that. It's sure it's heavy and it's extreme. But the good vocalists, like you mentioned, Glenn, and he, you know, back in the day, you're 100% right, was spectacular. Like he's doing, like you could take those vocals out and sing them, and they would sound amazing. So I think that's why I try to tell people you would get it that way.
Yeah. Well, but also, you know, first of all, there is melody in Deicide's music, right? If you listen to like some of the guitar parts, there is some melody to be found. But also with Deicide, what attracted me to them was just you know, they have hooks, right? Their music, and you can't really say the same about Cannibal. That was one of my issues with Cannibal early on, is I couldn't listen to like Eaten Back to Life at the time and pick out hooks and choruses and parts I would remember to the same level as you would in a band like Deicide. And I just love the fact that the songs were structured, that there were hooks. And of course, death metal has evolved now to a different place, right? Where I think with a lot of the new school kids these days, they don't care about having repetition and structure. Like they don't care if a song goes from point A to point F and just like has all these different stops. Like they don't need things to come back and repeat. To me, death metal these days, it's more like an Olympic event, right? Like, okay, how many animals can the singer sound like? How fast? It's just like, it's the Olympics. Like everybody's just trying to do everything to an extreme, right? And they don't care about structure. They don't care about choruses. And back in the day when I was signing these bands, that's what attracted me to them, was the fact that the records were structured. And Brian, and skipping ahead, you look at a record like Once Upon the Cross, right? I mean, that is probably the best Deicide record. And I always make a joke about that record that it sounds like a death metal record, but if you strip it down to its essence, which is like these 3.5 minute songs with not an ounce of fat, with verses, pre-chorus, chorus, and repeating structures, you really could play any of those songs on that record on an acoustic guitar. I mean, they could be Bon Jovi songs. Like it's really like such a hyper commercial death metal record. People don't even realize how commercial Once Upon the Cross is because it kicks their head in. But it's a commercial record.
I think that's the case with all the good death metal, is that it's basically the you know, take the vocals out, it's heavy metal music, and if you take the vocals out, it's metal. I took, and again, you know, I mentioned Amon Amarth earlier, and they're an interesting example because they came from the death metal world, but they're not really there now. But you know, our friend Eddie Trunk, who's doesn't get into any of the heavy stuff, doesn't like it, just out of the blue said, you know, Amon Amarth's playing Vegas, I want to go. I'm like, oh well, come with me. So we went to the show, and Amon Amarth's music is it sounds like Iron Maiden, basically. It's very commercial sounding stuff. And Eddie was watching the show. He goes, "Oh, this is actually really good. The vocals don't bother me that much, and the music's just like regular metal." So we talked to the band afterwards. He even played it on their show. But that's what I always try to tell people, is that these songs by all these great bands, and you're 100% right, these are catchy, almost structured, you could say, even in a pop way, about how the songs are structured and the way they are. And that's why I love talking to people who really love death metal, trying to explain it to people. And I think once you kind of get into it like that, you can understand it a lot better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting what you said about Amon Amarth too, because my goal, to me, the best part is when you have a band, you sign them as a death metal band, but they evolve into like a metal band, right? And I was lucky enough to have that happen twice, both with Sepultura and Fear Factory.
Yep.
They started out as death metal bands, and then they evolved into just, people aren't going to call Fear Factory a death metal band now.
No.
They're not going to call Sepultura a death metal band, the same way they wouldn't say that about Amon Amarth. So to me, like, I wasn't just signing these bands purely to be death metal bands. Like, in some cases I was, right? Like, Deicide's always going to be Deicide. Like, it's not going to morph into a bigger picture anything. It's going to stay within that genre. But ultimately, I was, to me, the brass ring was to sign a band that could be a credible death metal band, but that might one day evolve into something bigger. Exactly like Sepultura Fear Factory.
Exactly. And, we talked about just recently with the great Jose Mangin about Sepultura. And that was, really a groundbreaking band, because they were the first band to kind of come from the death metal scene and break out and become this massive brand and band. It was morphed into two bands now, I guess. But yeah, it's just, it's incredible how they did that. And I think that just when we go back to the 70s and, even like, Sabbath and Purple and some of those bands, or even, Judas Priest, that stuff was so extreme back then. It's like those bands are never going to be big. I remember Priest was like, that is some, underground heavy metal band. And then they became huge. And it's kind of everything goes over time where that stuff happens again. And now you see, Sepultura kind of broke the doors open. And then, so many other bands are hugely popular in a large part because of them too.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
and I agree with you too about Deicide, and that's why it was really interesting that you picked them, because we haven't talked a lot of death metal on the show, but it's an extremely important part, and we're getting to more of it now, which I like. But Deicide, I think because of Glenn's personality and his histrionics, or whatever you want to call it, they don't really get enough credit, almost like the way Alice Cooper did, I think, because of his stuff. I don't think they get enough credit as to how good a band they were and how influential they were on the death metal scene.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, I really think that Deicide were the pinnacle band as far as that scene goes, because I just feel that Glenn Benton, it was superior to all those other vocalists. He sounded scarier. You could understand his words. He was very enunciated. He pioneered the demon scream, or whatever you want to call it, layering the high-pitched, wails behind the death metal guttural vocals, and just being a great songwriter. And not to take away anything from the other members of Steve Ashheim on drums, the Hoffman brothers at the beginning, and the guitarist that Glenn has worked with since. Just really a pioneering death metal band. I don't think that there was any band really that could touch what Deicide were doing on their first 4 records. I'm including, the first Deicide record, self-titled, Legion, Once Upon the Cross, and Serpents of the Light. Serpents of the Light doesn't really get the respect that Once Upon the Cross does, but Serpents of the Light really is Once Upon the Cross Part 2. It just didn't have the heavy production. It had a crappier production than Once Upon the Cross, so people don't really give it those same props. But that record is almost equally as amazing as Once Upon the Cross. So I don't think there was really any death metal band that could touch Deicide back then. I mean, maybe Morbid Angel were like challenging, ton of respect for Morbid Angel.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and the other, by the way, if you didn't know Monty was in New York City, you can really tell by the siren there in the background.
Are they loud?
No, it was fun. I love it. I mean, it makes me miss New York a bit more. But The one thing that we do have to talk about when we're talking about the death metal scene, the early death metal scene, you mentioned him already a few times, is Scott Burns, and also Morris Sound Studios, and we've talked about them before on the show, specifically with Sepultura and some other stuff. And Scott was I think, just like a lot of the early, pick any early Bill Matoya, for example, if there wasn't like a producer around that understood the music and make it sound good, and Scott Burns being the guy for the death metal scene in the early days. I mean, I think that was so important to get a really good producer engineer in there and play in a really good studio and make this stuff sound really good. Because if you didn't have that, it would have been much more difficult, I think.
Yeah, I mean, prior to Scott, there was nobody like in that side of the industry that really understood the music and could capture it and get it to sound good. And that's why we did so many records with Scott and so many records at Morris Sound. And I mean, Scott, he's like literally the nicest guy you could ever meet, the most humble. He won't even own any of his success. He's too humble to even do that. And, Scott worked inexpensively, worked tirelessly, and was just always on the side of the bands wanting to do things right. Brian, you would know this, like back in the day, it became very common for bands, for producers to take points on records, right? So you hire so-and-so, Colin Richardson, and you pay him 2 points, 3 points as a producer. That was kind of the norm back then. Scott refused to take points. He didn't want to take it from the bands, right? Yeah. He's like, I'm coming in, you're hiring me for like a month to make a record. It's work for hire. It's like hiring a plumber, right? You bring a plumber into your house to fix your sink. He doesn't leave with like a point on your sink or anything other than like what, you just hired him to be a plumber. And that's how Scott looked at it. Just work for hire, right? There's no reason why you should take points. It's a cash grab against the bands. And that was just another brilliant thing about Scott that made him like a real advocate and friend of the bands, is that he really, really, truly cared.
Yeah, and those of you who don't know what a point is a percentage of the royalties that usually comes from the bands. When the producers take the points, it generally comes out of the band share. And it's not uncommon to do that. But you do mention, Scott was just all about the bands making it and the band sounding good. But, for him to understand that type of music and really make it sound that good was, again, I think a huge piece in what helped make this scene, especially in the early days in Tampa, and also Morris Sound, which is, now a historical landmark in Tampa, Florida, which is great because it's a wonderful, beautiful studio. And again, it's a state-of-the-art studio. And here you have these, underground death metal bands with a great producer recording in the state-of-the-art studio that, lended these records to sound so good. Like I was listening to this song and record the other day, and I forgot, like, man, this sounds so good. I put it up against anything that you listen to today. And a guy, for example, a producer like Rick Rubin, his style is very similar to what Scott was doing in the early 80s with the way he makes his records sound.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the challenge, what Scott saw as the challenge of death metal was, how do we make everybody in the band heard, right? How do we take this music and you can hear what everybody's actually doing? And, Scott and Morris Sound are, the pioneers of the quote unquote typewriter kick drum, right? Like the clicky type. They invented that. And I think the reason Scott came up with that is because by adding the typewriter sound allowed you to hear what the kick drums were doing, right? I mean, that was Scott's ultimate goal, was to get every instrument heard.
And it's and it's really hard in this genre to do it, because metal in general is difficult because you've got low bass, the guitars are always low, and like I said, you've got the kick drums, and everything's kind of in the same low mid range, and trying to get the separation on all those is always very difficult. Well, now you add in the vocals of death metal that are also very low and guttural. It's all in that same space. So you're 100% right. To get everything heard is very difficult. So the logical thing for Scott to do was, make the kick drums a little lighter so you could actually hear them.
Yeah, exactly. And then Pantera kind of kept that going too, right? Like, Pantera also had the triggered kicks. I think bands are doing that less these days. Obviously, it's not as challenging these days to get everything heard because technology has come so far that if you listen to, like, an Amon Amarth record or some of these records we're working on now, and you put them up against these old records, it just, I mean, they kind of dwarf them, right?
Technology is so insane now, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a little less challenging to do that. But back then, Scott, the only way you were going to get the kick drums heard is to make them sound like typewriters.
It makes sense. It makes complete sense.
But it wasn't just Scott. I mean, you had Tom Morris and Jim Morris also.
Yes.
It was those, and Dan Johnson, of course. How do I forget Dan? Like, those were the four guys that collectively put Morrisound on the map. Of course, Scott was the death metal portion of that. But some of these other death metal bands also worked with Dan, Tom, and Jim because, you couldn't, you want to like share the wealth. Scott's busy doing different things, and bands find other people they like. So they were really all doing that over time. But it was really Scott that began it, that brought death metal into Morrisound.
Yeah, and the other thing that I always find interesting with the whole death metal genre, and we'll put Glenn Benton to the side for a minute on this one, but is just the fact that everybody's just normal, regular guys. They're not doing anything crazy. I remember being in the studio with Cannibal Corpse. I forget which record, one of the early records. And Morbid Angel was in. Morrisound had two studios there, and Morbid was in one studio and Cannibal was in the other. We just kind of hang out in the break room. And I remember talking to Trey, who was in Morbid Angel at the time. And just a bunch of really good guys, and we're just talking about life events and politics or whatever it is. And it's just like this normal conversation, normal kind of, everybody just hanging around like normal people. And people always think, oh, these death metal guys, they're so crazy and these lyrics are so insane and it's all dark and everything. It's like, no, they're like horror movies, people aren't like that at all.
I mean, look, they're really all actors in a way, right? Like,
yes.
Remember when we first heard Venom? I remember when I first heard Welcome to Hell, I thought I was going to hell if I just played that thing. I was like, I mean, people are going to laugh their heads off now hearing this, but like, you could identify with this too. Back then, it was so scary.
Yep.
It was terrifying. And you really thought that the guys in Venom were these dudes. But then you meet them and they're just a bunch of fucking clowns. They're just jokers. It's all a shtick. And that includes Glenn Benton, right? I mean, Glenn was like more convincing than most, right? Because he actually went ahead and burned it upside down across his head. So if there's anybody that you thought would be that scary guy in person, it was Glenn. But it's quite the opposite. If you've seen interviews with Glenn, the guy's like, he's a joker. He's like hysterical. He'll have you cracking up the whole time. So yeah, it really is that way in most cases. Now, I wouldn't say the same thing about some of these black metal bands from Norway, these like church burning dudes.
Yeah, that's a little different.
Some of those guys are the real deal. Like, that is no act,
Yeah, that's a bit different. That's a bit different, not in a good way. 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, what you're saying about like these death metal guys being normal guys, I mean, you could really say that way about any one of these bands, whether it's Carcass or Deicide or Cannibal Corpse or Morbid Angel. They're normal dudes,
Well, I was going to Japan for one of the Loud Parks back in the day, and the plane was filled with just a whole bunch of different bands, and I was sitting next to the Napalm Death guys, and I didn't really know them very well, but they were hysterical. So it was a fun long plane ride to Japan sitting next to those dudes because they were pretty funny, But yeah, you're 100% right about all that stuff. But I do agree with you about Venom. I remember when that record came out. Even before that, I'd heard their original singles that they put out on the Great Neat Records, which was a huge influence, I'm sure, to both of us. But yeah, that first Venom record was scary. You're 100% right. That was scary. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is insane.
To me, that record still beats black metal. I mean, I know black metal is a more famous record, but there's something about Welcome to Hell that just is even better.
Oh, I agree 100%. I mean, I love black metal, of course, the name black metal, but I think that first Venom record is just tremendous.
And of course, it only lasted for two albums for Venom because
I know.
Then you hear At War with Satan. It looks the part. You want it to be great, but there's something about At War with Satan. It just doesn't have what those first two records have. I describe it as, and Brian, you'd appreciate this, like a band is in the zone, right? When you're in the zone, you're just shitting out the fucking magic, right? You're not even trying hard. It's just pouring out of you. And that's what you heard on those first two Venom records. And then somehow At War with Satan comes along and it's got a great cover. It's got a great title. It's exactly what you want it to be. But then you put it on and there's just something missing. Like the band left the zone somehow, and once you're out of the zone, it's really, really hard to get back in.
Yeah, it's like I equate it to you're pushing a boulder up the side of a mountain. As long as you're going forward, you're doing well. You start going backwards, it's really hard to get that ball rolling again. Same thing like you mentioned. So, but
yeah.
Unfortunate. But anyway, dude, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. great insight on the early days of death metal. And yeah, it's always good to talk to you anyway. So thanks again for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's hang out next time you're back in New York.
Yes, sir. And you can't leave yet.